Good morning, and for those of you on the East Coast, good afternoon. My name is Don Wilkinson, and on behalf of the Institute of Corporate Directors, and of course our good friends BCN TV and all my colleagues at Deloitte, welcome to the Director Series. Our topic today is a really an important one for boards, and that is how do you take the long-term view in the boardroom table? How do you not spend too much time on short-term issues? We had some discussions before we jumped on this panel. We certainly see a number of challenges to that, and hopefully we're going to be providing some thoughts on how you might change that. So easy to do, quite another thing to actually operationalize in your organizations. Now, we're broadcasting to you live. We're tucked away in the Rogers Center here in Toronto, broadcasting to you live to 12 cities, tip to tip across the country. I understand a very strong registration for the session today, so obviously a strong interest in this very important topic. Now, let's take a look at our agenda. And as I was thinking about this, I was reflecting back to the Director Series we had in early January. And if you recall, for those that attended, we talked about one of the big challenges was the current economic environment. And if I can take you back to the start of January, things were not looking too good. If you recall, markets were heading south pretty quickly. There was some real concerns about global growth. China was slowing down. Perhaps a bit of a bright spot in the U.S. But for us here in Canada, when you think about commodity prices, the oil and gas industry, concerns that this was not just cyclical, this was a structural issue, some real concerns. So boards really needed to think hard about that long-term strategy and growth in this kind of environment. And I think in that context, the topic today, taking a long-term view, is particularly important. I do appreciate, though, that's pretty challenging because for many out there, this is just a question of survival. So how do you move? Obviously, survival is critical, but how do you also make sure you're thinking about the long term? So specifically in terms of what we're going to look at, first of all, examine a bit of some of the pressures that are on widely held public corporations and why the move to the short term. What some of the consequences are of that. And we're going to look at some other governance models. And my guess is you'd say, well, gee, they don't get very good governance scale ratings for these type of organizations. But I can tell you, at least in the Canadian context, performance-wise, taking the long-term view has been quite effective, and that's about family-controlled businesses. So what can we learn from that? We'll spend some time talking about it. Institutional investors, it'll be very interesting what their perspective is. When you think about those organizations, obviously their liability structure, they're paying pensions over decades. So they need to be thinking about long-term investment returns. So we'll hear from a major institutional investor. How are they thinking about the long term? What do they think about when they get to their investee companies, be it they private companies or the public companies? What are the things that are on their radar screen? Now, no discussion about the long term would be complete without a discussion of the activists. And the activists, to some extent, get a bit of a label of being short-term. So maybe we'll explore, is that really true or not? But certainly one of the key things that will come out is what happens when those activists come knocking. What do you need to do to respond? And you do need to respond. And perhaps more importantly, what can you do to perhaps avoid that call from the activist? And finally, what we're going to end up on is hearing from an experienced director, some of his reflections on how corporations need to take the long-term view, but clearly you need to have performance. And how do you reconcile that short-term versus long-term perspective? Some thoughts from that individual who's also been around and seen some activists at play. Now, as always, there's no such thing as a free lunch or breakfast, as the case may be. We're going to put you to work during the course of the next 2 hours. We're going to put out a couple of questions. Some of the issues that we're dialoguing on here at the panel will get you talking about in your local setting. The other thing we'll try to do is find some time to take some questions and hopefully provide some answers. Please don't wait to the end to get your questions into us. There are cards in each of your local settings. When a question comes to mind, get it on the card, get it to the administrator. They'll get it to us here in Toronto. We'll do our best at the end to respond to those questions and provide answers. So let's, joining me in the studio is a very accomplished and experienced group of directors and other executives. I know my short introduction is not going to do them service, so do have a look at your handout package. You'll see the fuller CVs that are included in there. On my left is Wes Hall. Now, you might recognize Wes because he's been recently recognized as one of Canada's businessmen most powerful 50. So an important guy to get to know. Wes is the founder and chief executive officer of Kingsdale Shareholder Services. And Wes, I think it was 2003 that you started up the company. Wes has got extensive experience in terms of corporate governance and, of course, shareholder communications. And I think you'll recognize the name and his firm's name in terms of some pretty high-profile campaigns and proxy battles. CP comes to mind, Wes. Their organization has advised a number of the major corporations here in Canada: Air Canada, Barrick, CP, of course, Suncor, Citigroup in the U.S., BH Billiton. So a company that's really made a mark in this space. And this is really a transformative piece, so you're going to be hearing more about that. Wes, delighted to have you on the Director Series and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Don.
Next to Wes is Andre Bourbonnais. Andre is the President and Chief Executive Officer of PSP Investments. Andre, I think it's about a year now you've been sitting in that seat.
Exactly a year.
Now, maybe you don't know PSP Investments, but I can tell you under Andre's leadership, you're going to be hearing a lot more about PSP Investments. They are a very major institutional investor. I think Andre said something like 115 billion of assets under management put to play here in Canada, but also globally. So obviously we're going to have a very significant impact on the capital markets. Before joining PSP, he spent some time over at CPP Investment Board. He was the executive managing director, global head of their private investments. He's a lawyer, I understand, by training. He says not a lot, but he was chief legal counsel over at Teleglobe and also spent some time over in Europe consulting on M&A. So, Andre, welcome to the Director Series.
Thank you very much, Don.
Next to Andre is Paul Haggis. Paul is the chair of Alberta Enterprise Corporation, which is looking after venture capital investments. He's also the chair of the Governance and Compensation Committee over at Athabasca Oil. That's working through some of that challenging environment out west. And I think many of you will remember Paul in terms of activist campaigns. And there was something Mr. Ackman and CP, and I think, Paul, you were on the slate and were, in fact, chair of CP post that situation. So a lot of experience background in terms of activists. Also very much involved as a senior executive. He was the CEO of OMERS. And Andre talking about a few degrees of separation. He was the interim CEO at PSP Investments and on the board well before your time. And for those of you out west would recognize Paul in terms of Alberta Treasury branches. So Paul, welcome to the Director Series. And last but certainly not least, a very familiar face, David Beattie. David, you will well know in terms of strategy, in terms of governance. He is a professor at the Rotman School of Business, very active in the terms of the Director Education Program. David, I think it's the Conway Chair at the Clarkson Center for Business Effectiveness. And I know
Board Effectiveness.
Board, trying into business effectiveness, but board effectiveness. and obviously did a lot of some interesting work around family-controlled businesses. And David, I think I've got the count right, but 39 boards that you've been involved with, both in Canada and internationally.
I could never hold a job for very long.
There we go, 39, 9 of which chair of the board. He also is a past managing director of the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance and recognizes in the Order of Canada. So a very distinguished career, lots on governance, lots of experience. David, you've been with us before. Welcome back, and we're looking forward to your comments. Now, back to the topic, it's about long-term investing and what can the boards do to take that perspective. And it's been interesting. There's been a lot of press around this saying, hey, we need to move away from this excessive short-termism. We need to get focused on the long term. A lot of groups have been studying this and putting issues and papers forth. Down in the U.S., the Aspen Institute has come out with some principles. The OECD has actually put out a number of papers in terms of long-term financing and investing. And recently, McKinsey and CPP Investment Board have done something called Focusing Capital on the Long Term. It's interesting, as part of that, they did a survey of 600 directors and executives. And what they were asking is, what is causing this push for public companies to be focused on the short term? What was the primary reason? And the interesting response was almost 50% of those individuals came back and said it was the board. The board is pushing short-term actions. And in fact, if you looked at a subset, if you just looked at the directors, even more, higher percentage said, it's the board that's pushing short-termism. And there was a recent Harvard Business Review article that came out, boards just aren't working. So, as context, maybe I'll get my panelists' reaction to that observation. You agree it's the board's fault? Others at play? Just a reaction to that statement. Maybe David, I'll start with you.
I think the boards are more likely to be the transmission mechanisms from the shareholders, the Wall Street analysts, pushing harder and harder for short-term performance. So I describe the pressure coming from outside the board but being transmitted by the board through to the management teams.
And maybe Andre, as a big institutional investor, your thoughts on, who the culprits are?
Well, I think it's hard to draw a line and have absolutely a clear trend as to who's responsible for the short-termism. But certainly, the focus on quarterly results is that coming from the shareholder? Is that coming from the board? Is that coming from the management and the way they're compensated? There could be a number of culprits here.
Paul, any reflections?
I suspect that why boards are getting pressure for short-term do something is because the share price is down. If the share price is up, you don't have the same kind of pressure.
And that's a theme we're going to hear a bit about, Paul, today. And so I don't know, what about those activists?
Listen, I personally believe that it's in fact the system that's the problem. The system is set up to reward people for the short term. As Andre said, you have quarterly reportings that you have to do. You have yearly compensation, say and pay that you have to really vote on. So at the end of the day, if you don't perform well in the short term, the company gets punished. So as a result of that, that pressure now gets into the boardroom, and that pressure now puts on the backs of management.
So when you think about that, to change the system, to your point, Wes, some real challenges to shift from short term to the long term.